We're hearing simultaneous translation.
This is only a structure made of wood and sheet metal that is actually a lookalike. So this is meant by operational strategic masking or camouflage. Question, can we assign an exhibit number to this photograph, Your Honors?
Just before we do that, you say this is just a lookalike. Does it work like a missile system, or it doesn't work? It's just a lookalike that doesn't work.
Časný sud.
Your Honors, this is just a model of a missile system used to deceive the adversary about the position of the real missile. This is not a missile.
Thank you. I guess the short answer is it doesn't work like a missile.
Da.
Thank you.
Yes.
The document is admitted into evidence. May I please give me the exhibit number?
No, that will be exhibit number D210.
So as I was doing my research, I began by reading court transcripts, and eventually I would request video footage of the actual court proceedings through the press office. So this is what we have on the right. Here is the footage that the court itself is producing, in fact. So another example.
I have just two pieces of evidence I'd like you to look at, again, with the assistance of the usher. If you could take a look at some concrete. Again, I'd ask you to examine the bag to see where, to see if the seal has been violated. Can I ask you to
rare in the court
it
to enter in? They usually only exist on a screen.
Now, I know you have no personal knowledge of where this material came from, but could I ask you to read what's written on the bag just so that the record knows, or the record is recorded, the label that the material came out of?
It states that it's a portico over the entrance of the door.
Okay. Now, could I ask you to look at what are chips of concrete, correct?
That's correct.
And could I draw your attention to the blackened areas on them? And my question to you is, sir, this is not mold, is it?
No, it's just
Is it not concrete with smoke on it?
No, it is not.
How are you so sure that it's not smoke?
Well, if you examine, you even have black flakes of the mortar within. It's just black concrete. Concrete varies in color.
Okay.
If you look on that side, closely, you have gray, darker gray there. That's darker there. It's just a different color.
Okay, but there's no mold on that, is there?
Not on that. I'm sorry, Your Honors. Not on that piece. No.
Okay, and the concrete over the door, directly over the door, it's your evidence that there was mold on that portion of the door.
Yes, there was in several areas.
Okay.
The video shows one area that did not have mold.
If that could be returned to Yourselski, if I could one more.
So what we have there is, as I said, it's a very unusual occurrence where someone will actually ask, in the ICCY,
Again, if you could read
where someone would actually
what's
ask
on the
to
label
see
here.
Evidence in the flesh. Usually what we see is an image of evidence. See that in the very next example of the model. It's a photograph of a model of a Marska, which was used as a concentration camp in Bosnia, in the region of Prijedor. And witnesses will then point out things on important history of the ICI. So many people are prosecuted in relation to Marska. So photographs of that model. Many some photographs cropped, sometimes they and the visual material have information, and as it gains it, it actually information of the sort of procedural activities is imprinted on these materials, and so there's a way in which as they move through the court, they also capture some of the attributes, the practices of the legal machine itself. They register traces of the ways in which these materials are handled. I'll play you a little bit of the clip from the beginning of a discussion between a prosecutor and a judge and a witness who's a survivor of a Marska in the next clip. And the only other thing I guess I would mention, there was a little ant that got trapped in that evidence bag. So there was, was this kind of extraordinary, like diminutive sort of creature that also the camera person in the court is obviously, was clearly perhaps more interested in zooming in on those little bits of concrete, because we see quite a lot of that sort of footage. But there's a kind of interesting moment where you have a sort of strange intruder, I guess, into the evidence.
Your Honour, it's very remiss of me. I should have showed you a photograph of the Marska camp earlier. I am so familiar with this case, it just goes without saying. Could the witness please be shown from the bundle of photographs, the photograph marked with the ERN number 00409592?
Well, actually, Ms. Sutherland, the witness was shown a photo of Marska on document P1.1.
Yes, Your Honour, that's an aerial
which we
view.
identified as number 6, photo number 6.
Yeah, that's an aerial view, Your Honour. This is a much closer photograph.
So this is going to be 1128.4?
Yes, Your Honour.
This is the rear view model of a Marska, no?
No, 9592. It should be the front view.
Not according to the index that I have. 9592 is the rear view. 9596 is the front view. But anyway, what I suggest is that you show both photos and then. But anyway, they speak for themselves, but we can't really.
I think I'm going to skip ahead to actually, it was because Marska has a direct connection to London here, and that is, and I made a short documentary in the summer of 2012 during the in relationship to the opening of the Olympic Park in London. I worked on the case of Marska in different ways, but I thought this was an opportunity to sort of revisit some clips from this sort of documentary. So I'm going to play two, and we're jumping basically in the middle of a sort of half-hour. It's a bit. I realize that it's going to be a bit hard to see because it's because we have a lot of lights on, but if you can make sure there's audio. So we're just going to see a couple of short clips.
In 2004, ArcelorMittal assumed 51% ownership of the Lubia mining complex in Prijedor, Republic of Srpska, Bosnia and Herzegovina, an acquisition that included the Omarska mine. Once a spectral silence hung over these buildings, a cavernous rust-colored hangar containing a heavy industrial plant and piles of tires. A deserted complex once used as a canteen, and an empty, smaller building known as the White House. Underground lies a seam of oil, which remained untouched for 12 years while a hurricane of violence blew through this corner of Bosnia. But now this place is teeming again, with the rattle of machinery and the business of its original use as a mine. Press release, June 29th, 2011. ArcelorMittal confirms that 2,200 tons of steel being used in the ArcelorMittal Orbit, London's Olympic Tower, will contain symbolic quantities from every continent in the world where the company has operations, reflecting the spirit of the Olympic Games, which draws together athletes from across the globe. When word of ArcelorMittal's purchase first came to light, the spectre of buried bodies and even potential mass graves was immediately raised. Work had just concluded at one mass grave only 2 miles from the Omarska site, from which the remains of 420 men murdered in the camp were retrieved. In October 2001, another mass grave, containing 353 bodies, was found within another mine in the Lubia complex. Rising to the soaring height of 114.5 meters, and outstripping even the Statue of Liberty by 2 meters, the ArcelorMittal Orbit boasts an impressive compendium of statistics. 1,500 tons of steel, 35,000 bolts, 19,000 litres of paint, 770 visitors per hour, or 5,000 per day, vistas of 20 miles into the distance, and an overall price tag of £22.7 million, 19.6 million of which was funded by ArcelorMittal.
Where were you until you left the camp? I noticed by looking through the model before its top portion. You took the top portion off so you can see the room in which you were held.
Another series of facts. 3,400 blacks from Prijedor went missing or were killed during 1992, the summer of the massacre. At least 3,334 were imprisoned in the camp. 700 to 800 were exterminated. 37 female detainees were repeatedly raped and tortured. 50 men singled out daily for execution. Still missing, 1,000 men, women and children from the Prijedor region. The facts and figures of the ArcelorMittal orbit, the towering showpiece of the London 2012 Olympics, are intertwined with the history of war crimes that took place at Omarska. On the very grounds from which ArcelorMittal subsequently began to extract not only its soaring global profits, but iron ore that the director of ArcelorMittal Priedor boasts has been used in the construction of the orbit.
In a chance meeting on the 14th of April 2012, the director of ArcelorMittal Priedor made a rather disturbing revelation. He confirmed that the ArcelorMittal orbit in London is indeed fabricated with iron ore that comes from the Omarska mine.
It's the last day of our visit to Priedor. So this day we went to Kozara Mountain to see the monument. And then someone saw that the director of ArcelorMittal mine in Omarska was in the parking lot. We immediately went to speak with him, and somebody asked him the most important question. Will the ore from Omarska become also a part of Orbit Middle? He said yes, of course, and very, very proud of what will happen.
He said it's a...
Can we see that again, please? We have 00820, the IC number.
In the absence of a promised memorial, London's Olympic landmark, the ArcelorMittal orbit, was reclaimed as the Omarska Memorial in exile on July the 2nd, 2012.
We come to speak to you today of the problem of Bosnia, a problem that seems far away in time and space, but we hope to show you how present it is here on the site of the Olympics, both materially and politically. The thing that puts these sites and times together, Omarska concentration camp and the Olympic Village in London, from 1992 with 2012, is the ArcelorMittal orbit.
Reclaiming made possible because of the material power of steel to forge a connection between two disparate localities, events, and times, between two geographies where corporate power, aesthetic practice, and large-scale mining in interesting and dangerous ways. The camp in Omarska and the Olympic Tower in London.
Yeah, they asked the registrar to call the case.
Est-ce que le greffe peut annoncer l'affaire?
IT 9622A.
So that's one of the ways in which I've worked with some of the materials from the ICTY, and in this case with a community of survivors, and that was also done when I was working within the framework of forensic architecture and working with Grupa Spomenik and the Four Faces of Omarska. So those are artists and activist groups in Bosnia. And I wanted to show a little, as I mentioned, I showed you that clip from the irradiated film. I thought I would show you a little clip from a documentary I did, quite a different kind of work. I'm seeing that it's, I think I'll sort of cut it a bit short, but I'll play this clip and maybe just show you a couple of visual examples. This is from the documentary called Material Witness.
President of court, please quiet in the courtroom.
אדוני מדבר עברית? בבקשה לשים את הכיפה על הראש.
Literary critic Shoshana Feldman has argued that the very difficulty of producing an intelligible narrative in the face of historical trauma is that which characterizes the true act of bearing witness. Drawing upon an incident that took place during the Eichmann trial, in which a witness fainted while attempting to testify. She asks, can the withdrawal of the legal conventions of speech testimony in its own right? Rather than reducing their capacity to stand convincingly as technical witnesses to a crime, the electronic defects of Loshi's massacre tape supplement their capacity for testimony. Their impoverished technical production amplifies the radical incomprehensibility of the events they archive. Erratic movement, blurred focus, and dropout made to speak on behalf of those who no longer can. Forcing wholeness and clarity from the massacre videos, distressed image fields would violate the events anew, which is what happened under cross-examination and forensic analysis.
Did you, later when you went to Izvica, take with you a camera, or rather, did you arrange for this videotaping in order to document the event which you wished to document? Is that what you did?
The filming of the footage from the Izbica massacre was not done by me alone. It was myself with Sefedin, the assistance of the civilian population and members.
Stop there just because supposed to wrap. We're wrapping up at 8:30. So I just wanted to show you a couple of other images from installations. This is actually 16 separate video channels, but I don't think I will play the clip. I'm gonna, maybe I can, and there's another view, and I'll play a little bit of this just to give you a sense of how I was trying to work with the material, the evidential materials from the court, and try, in this case...
Thank you. Your Honors.
It's very different than my projects where I use voice
by this statement,
this is working
I wish
just with the materials
to explain to you in the simplest and shortest way possible the reasons for my guilty count 5 of the indictment. I arrived at this decision on my own without any kind of pressure, threat, or persuasion by my counsel or by the prosecutors. And I decided to come before this tribunal and admit that a crime happened in Srebrenica in which I myself I expect adequate punishment.
Something happening to the audio, but that's fine. I wanted to just, as I said, bring up a couple of images of sort of installations. So in working with some of these materials, sometimes with the case of the London story, that the legal materials sit inside a larger story, if you will, and other times I'm trying to work with the sort of specificity of the materials as they exist as part of the legal archive of the ICTY, but I think I'll just leave it there. That gives you a sense of how these things are entering, these materials are entering into my creative practice and the different sort of modes of, I guess, narration and public narration that I'm trying to, was trying to kind of develop, because that's one of the key things that has also been said to me is the necessity for producing new forms of public narration, especially when materials come out of these kinds of, come out of contexts in which, as Richard so demonstrated so well or spoke about, their contexts in which the, say, our knowledge of say, legal procedures, etc., rules of evidence, etc., might be would naturally be quite kind of constrained. So the necessity of public narration is one of the sort of key, say, tasks that I give myself as an artist. Often lately I've been working more with scientists, so that's a similar kind of sort of responsibility is that of not just mediation, but how we actually work to narrate things that often are very complicated or highly abstract in nature. So leave it there.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah, provocative and interesting. As well, I suppose, things to see. In the interest of time, I understand I'm going to open up responses with Linda first, if you're so kind.
Shall I swap seats with you and then I
Yeah,
see my own
why don't we
that
both
should work, and as you
maybe we should switch with Linda and John.
Oh.
Yeah. Sorry,
Shall I start, John? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay. Yeah, there was really fascinating presentations, as I'm sure you'll agree, and there's almost too much to talk about. So what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit about what Richard has referred to as visual jurisprudence, actually, and I think it's a concept that's now being extended to a sort of jurisprudence of the senses amongst certain lawyers who are thinking about how we see, how we interact with visual media, but also how we hear and taste and smell law in the courtroom and elsewhere. I wanted to start with by saying something quite conventional, actually, though. I think there's always been a strong visual element to law. There's always been a performance element to the trial, legal rituals, symbolism, dress, and actually even the way that advocates prompt us to imagine what might have happened, to paint a picture in our minds of what has happened. That lawyers for many centuries were trained in the art of rhetoric, in the art of verbal persuasion, and I think we now have new ways in which they can reinforce what has been a very traditional and long-standing convention in law. We've sort of lost that teaching of rhetoric in modern law schools as we have become science schools, and we teach legal science and all that sort of logic that Richard was talking about. But I think it's important to remember those connections with the past before getting overly excited about new approaches and technologies, so that we look at just disjunctions as well as continuities. But it's clearly the case that new technology, testimony and evidence have quite literally changed the way that legal subjects are seen, the way the legal system is seen, and infringements of law are seen. One of the things that's quite exciting about that is the subversive possibilities, and I think Susan's work really proves that, the ways that we can start thinking about alternative ways of giving testimony. So we know that the press have always been very interested in visual representations of law. They were actually banned from taking photographs in English courtrooms in 1925 because actually the judges and members of Parliament and the King, it's all in the National Archives, how the King objects to all these representations of trials, often the divorce trials of his friends. It was only the nobility that could really get divorced very easily at that time. So there's always been a concern about the way that the press represent law, but now, of course, with mobile phones, we have journalism and the if you're an avid YouTube, films that go up and photographs that people take illegally of courtroom scenes. surveillance cameras, but we also know that there are official photographers paid for by NGOs to go and take photographs of police behaving in inappropriate ways at marches and protests. So there's a sort of two-edged way of looking at this proliferation of images, and I don't think we need to just think of it as always being in the control of the legal elite. I was also struck when I was watching the work that Susan was talking about, how independent filmmakers have told different stories about those abuses in Bosnia, especially around women, so-called comfort women, rape survivors, who many feminists would say were not well treated by the prosecutors or by the international courts. And they have turned often to independent film to make docudramas about their experiences of giving birth to the children of their rapists and having to look into the face of those children who they are responsible for bringing up on a daily basis. And I think that's also a really important way in which the narrative of those international courts has been subverted through the use of film and a different sort of testimony. It's also interesting how some of that subversion has come home to the legal system. So I'm thinking in particular of the South African Constitutional Court and the Mexican Constitutional Court, which they have been furnished with images which explicitly make reference to the complicity of law and human rights abuses as part of a way of understanding their past. So the subversion, it seems to me, is quite important. It's almost sort of the opposite of your Olympic sculpture that you were talking about. They are making that complicity and part of the power of the image-making process. So I've spent 10 years researching the 700-year history of the architecture of law courts, and as Richard summed up in a few seconds, really, it's pretty irrelevant now because we're not building any more courts. We are in the age of the virtual trial. And of evidence being beamed in from prisons, people being sentenced to life imprisonment over video link to the courthouse in the laptop, as people are calling it. And we're doing it really badly, and we're doing it without designers and architects, without choreographers, without theatre directors. We're doing it with engineers. And one of the things that interests me about that ICTI image is what a mess that was. I know it wasn't built as a courthouse, but it was built as a courtroom. It was fitted out as a high security courtroom. And in addition to that sensory confusion that we have of men's faces and women's voices, as we have the simultaneous translation, that seems to me, a disruption in itself. We also, in that room, had people physically giving evidence and also appearing on the screens in front of counsel and judges at the same time. That made sense when it was remote evidence, when they were being beamed in, but they would also be on the screen at the same time as being physically present in the room when they appeared. And on another screen next to that one, you would have the simultaneous translation from English to French. So you're hearing the wrong voice for the wrong face, you're seeing the person before you in flesh, and you're seeing them on a screen, and then you have two languages going in front of you. So it seems to me, as architects, that's a challenge for you, because we are allowing engineers to design these spaces for us. And when I went on a tour, I go on a tour every year with judges and architects of courthouses around the world, really sad, nerdy tour. There are 20 of us, the only people in the world that I think are interested. We were so shocked to be shown around that courtroom by an engineer, by an IT engineer, and there seemed to have been no design consultancy there about how those spaces were being used. And what that means is, in Australia, where I think they're doing some of the best work on this with architects, we find spaces where video links where people are being beamed in, Aboriginals. Courtrooms are so remote in the sense and they're being beamed in, they're being alleged of guilty of criminal offences, and they're being beamed in for a space where they have a toilet sign behind them. Okay. So what does that do in terms of how we receive the image of that person, whether we dignify them or not? And actually architects are doing some really simple but clever work around what backdrops do you put behind people in order to dignify them, in order to make them look credible for those jurors that are sitting in Melbourne or Sydney? And what colours do you use? And what patterns work to dignify people? So some quite simple, but actually, I think quite profound work. One of the things that we're talking about in the courtroom as well, it's not just about those of us who are old enough to have sat in court, done a lot of court watching. So of time in a courtroom is they take notes. And there's a certain beauty if you're an advocate, because you get 10 minutes or perhaps 5 minutes or 2 minutes to just rethink what you want to say so that you can then perform the next segment of your presentation much better. There's a sociology of time in terms of people appearing in the courthouse. They approach a civic building, they cross the threshold from what Paul Rock calls the profane to the sacred, into the sacred home of law. They come into an enormous, often salle de pas perdu, as the French call it, the room of the lost steps. You go into a person-sized that has a sort of a sound, and then you go into the courtroom. So 700 years of architectural practice has taught us about the importance of journeys to courts in preparing people. Anyone who's been to the Supreme Court in Israel, probably the best example of it, you go up the stairs, there's a panorama of Old Jerusalem, and the architects talk about people coming before the Lord having to make a conscious decision to turn away from the city and go into the courtroom. So much thought has been put into how we prepare people for law in so many courtrooms, and now they're being beamed in very instantly without those rituals. So it seems to me we need to think about new rituals when we're thinking about this sort of evidence in preparing people for these sorts of experiences. So I just end quickly, really, on three questions. I wondered for both speakers, really, what we do about that sensory overload, how we slow things down in terms of the use of these new technologies in courts, and how we bring directors, choreographers, designers, architects into that process. And I also wondered how lawyers deal with these new technologies, because it was interesting. We had examples from both presentations of judges effectively saying that the image spoke for itself in terms of the car chase and the evidence, the plan, the photograph of the plan. And I wondered, actually, are judges that naive? I think they are visually illiterate, but I actually think most of us are visually illiterate. Of course, you guys are the exception. You're the designers, but most of us are visually illiterate. I was asked to give a plenary recently on the visual turn in law, and I asked the people who asked me to the conference, why don't you ask me to do something on law and the word? Why the visual? And they said there'd be too much to say if we asked you to talk about law in the world, which in itself says quite a lot, I think. Why is it that the visual is so new and exotic and this small category, whereas the word is this enormous empire that law assumes is full of complexity and sophistication? And I was struck really by Jennifer Mnookin's finding about visual evidence in the court, that actually it's never has the same status as other evidence. And I wondered if that stopped being the case now, with film being used so much in these clips and simulations. Because she said that lawyers will always prefer, judges will always prefer the oral testimony that can be tested. And I wondered, is that hierarchy changing? Is what Jennifer found still the case? Okay, so I think I've only asked two questions, but I've probably spoken for too long, so I'll leave it there and perhaps bring the other one in later. Yeah,
I think if you can.
Yeah, thank you. This is adding to the beautifully layered evening. I wanted to, first of all, say thank you to Susan to bring back this memory. I think it was the first encounter. Susan is a dear friend and colleague, and it's great to have. When you brought the picture of Chernobyl now reminds me the first time we met discussing the transformation of media, and the discussion for research architecture, and the outline of the discussion is something that we still carry on at the center, and this is just maybe the link between my work here at the AA and the evening is the idea that architecture is a sensor. It registers. It is the material sensors of activities. Some of them are, of course, violent activities. Others are about cohabitation. But it has an implication, this very simple observation, that there's a material registering in. And it is maybe apt that the conversation about the material registration, witnessing films or the auto is this very room where Yates was discussing the art of memory. And the way through which Francis Yates articulated the particular relationship between oratory and the material organization of buildings in the Roman art of memory then brings back the other element of the particular idea that architecture registers. Not only you use architecture to remind you that when you will enter, on the right there will be a column, and on the top of the column there's a particular form of a palm tree, and maybe I think of, in my case, my own, go on. For remembering events, but it shapes events. It is influencing events. Administering is not helping events. It's not in the minor tone of allowing events to occur, but it's really guiding them. And this is maybe the other condition that I think I wanted to bring at the table, the idea that this is a notion where the material basis of the law guides rather than simply help structuring. It's very clear that what you mentioned, that there's a visual condition of law from the very beginning. A friend of mine would say there's an obviosity in that. You know that policeman is the law because he's dressed in a different way. You know that the court is a different building because of particular ways of frontality of its presentation. That is a symbolic visual. What we are discussing, I think, is a slightly different condition, and that is the spatial dimension of the registering of social events, of the making of sovereign law and the making of somehow moments of evaluation, moments of recording of that law. So the questions that I think you both raised this evening are very much resonating with the school here, and I think that it's very interesting that some of the thoughts are not going that far. What Francis Yates indicated somehow as an intimation against the way we were thinking architecture is still here with us. And so I just wanted to conclude with a little remark, and maybe this is really en passant. And by the way, you mentioned that you are an esoteric group going visiting courts. When we visited with DIP 4, the International Court of Justice in The Hague, the clergy there were completely shocked. Do you really want to see the building? And there's nothing in this building. We actually using air conditioning systems. I want to see, and this maybe indicates that it's an alert who are from the school that were really relevant. You know, the last thing that we count, you know, the building. Yeah, it has an interesting air conditioning. But what I wanted to say at the end is that architecture does one thing, and it does it. It is better expressed in my other language, which is Italian. It frames time, but in Italian it's tempo, and tempo is, of course, both time but also weather. And I think that what you showed us today was that on many levels the juridical practices are considering these visual conditions, in particular the time-based practice, as framing time, but not weather. It didn't seem that beautiful observation of Susan of the recording medium taken into consideration in your presentation. It was how symbolically it operates, how it is put together on a time base. But what's the weather? What's the materiality of that? So this is what I think I get from your both presentation. On one side, there's a obvious necessity to bring architecture, understanding of space, understanding of the way it records and shapes events to as many audiences as we can. Legal, lawmaking, not only law practicing, but lawmaking audiences, generic publics, as many as we can, a natural intrusion in their world. And this is what this is all about. On one side, I think that there is also a pressure, and that is that the post-Berg maybe demands a little. It demands not only the engineering, the intimation that you brought. These things are not designed by architects. Of course they're not designed by architects, because architects are not interested in these things, and we're still thinking of representational space as in the early Renaissance, and we're obsessed with perspectival drawings, as simple as that. So please come and intrude on us more often, and we will try to intrude back. Thank you.
Thank you both. I suppose is the best word for it. Would you just like to take
Susan, do you want to sit
Would you like to just kind of a few words? I'm anxious of time at this week.
Well, thank you. Obviously, there's much more. I'm not sure if this is on. What? Is it on? Yeah. I'm not sure. Well, what I am sure of is it's way late in the evening, and the questions would delay us maybe into the early morning hours. But let me just say one thing, sparked by the art of memory and the emphasis on materiality, which is fascinating to me. The one thing that I'm suggesting here that plays into this notion of traditional materiality is the way in which these new technologies interpenetrate space. Live space, you go to a theater production these days, live space, live performance coincides with live video feeds, which coincide with taped loops that were previously recorded. Many different time frames. Different spaces are layered or interpenetrate. And you can say the same thing. You go into a courtroom or a museum or a school, which is lined with screens. And it's no longer just a physical space. It's partly a simulacrum. It's an intermediation. And I think one theme, I can't say much more, but one thing that is fascinating to me when we think about the rhetorical tradition, the art of memory, the interior spaces of corridors we walk along to reconstruct memory, Francis Yates's scholarship. Now, in so many ways, the interior is interpenetrated with the exterior. We outsource memory. We use devices that are archival sources of memory or even affect. And we're not even not just fully aware, but in control of the way in which we are distributed across multiple spaces, some of them material, some of them not, some simulated digitally, some in one time, some in another time. And so our devices have distributed reality in very curious ways that I don't think we've fully reckoned with, either architecturally or certainly legally. But the point of my insistence upon visual literacy is to gain at least some greater control over our awareness and critical capacity to deconstruct the complications of space and time in a way that allows us not to be taken in, but rather to deliberately interact in the service of truth testing and ultimately justice.
Do you want to say
just a couple of things. There's a, had I played the video a little longer, we would have seen this moment where Slobodan Milosevic, he acted in his own defense, and he's cross-examining the witness who had documented a massacre at Izbica, Kosovo on videotape. But Milosevic does ask a question. He goes like, I grant that there's a photograph, see dead bodies in a meadow, because all we really have is an image that seems to show us dead bodies in a meadow. It doesn't tell us how they got there. It doesn't tell us who killed them. And he was arguing that their whole set of presuppositions had been made, but in fact the image can't really tell us much at all. And Milosevic, it was quite an extraordinary moment, because he alerts, let's say, the judiciary or the court or the tribunal at that moment to all of the ways in which everyone had assigned specific kind of interpretations that were seemingly self-evident to the sort of image. So it was actually kind of interesting for me that came from him, but this kind of moment of sort of rupture that actually in some way also in that moment kind of unveiled all of the sort of elaborations that had preceded it. And maybe another just an anecdote that was told to me by Andras Riedelmeier, he's actually an Ottoman era art historian who, you probably know him, Linda, or maybe you don't, but anyway, he teaches at Harvard, but because he's interested in Ottoman era architecture, he had documented a lot of mosques that were eventually destroyed, and so consequently he became an expert witness and was called to The Hague about 6 times. But I remember him talking about the first time he was called as a so-called expert witness because the destruction of cultural property is one of the let's say attributes of crimes against humanity. And he said he was confronted by Milosevic, this war criminal, terrified about speaking in this very kind of obviously this very kind of elaborated space of the tribunal, and having to directly confront someone accused of genocide, crimes against humanity, etc. But Milosevic was translated for him by a woman. And so in his ears, he's hearing the voice of a female translator. So that completely changed the dynamic of his own kind of relationship, and settled him down, and he was actually able to testify because in some way the voice that came to him was this highly mediated voice, and it was a woman's voice. So there's a way in which that sort of, the ways in which let's say the media disarticulates all of the sort of, perhaps subject positions. It is an extremely kind of chaotic space on some level, and if you listen to and watch the proceedings, there's a zillion technical glitches because all of the translation systems that are going into 6 different languages are getting mixed up, etc. But I think it was interesting that kind of mediation in that case actually helped the witness deal with the kind of with the affective and psychological dimensions of what it meant to be in that sort of space. So it's just a kind of, I think, useful example.
Okay, well, I hope we can continue with some drinks now. Thank you everyone who stayed. Thank you to you guys for that. And,
Thanks for organizing.